So on to the next force, which is actually pretty similar to the pop axis force, and that is the pop curve force. And as the name suggests, you can control this force with a curve. So this is something you have to do, otherwise when you press start, nothing happens, because you actually need to give it a curve. And this is something you can do up here with either an absolute swap path, or you just use a context input. So let's say the second input, and let's put in a curve there. You can take any curve you want. Technically, as you know, even the edges of a geometry are curves. But what makes the most sense here is to use a draw curve, I think, because then you can just draw whatever direction you want. And what we can do is something like this. We draw it like this, and then a nice swirl up here, something like this. It's not absolutely necessary, but as you know, I usually recommend using a resample node after the draw curve, because what comes out of it is usually pretty horrible. So let's at least give it a little bit of a reasonable resolution, something like this. And now if I press start, and if I go in, you can see instantly something is happening. This totally depends on your scale. I'm actually not sure what scale we have right now. What you're seeing right now is, again, the red area of the influence of the curve. And you can change this here in the max influence radius. And by lowering this down, you get a better idea what's going on. And obviously it's just following the curve. So let's press start and see what happens. And you can already see the idea, but you can already see also the main problem with the curve. As usual, you have to balance out different forces here. But before we do this quickly, this is actually treated as a wind force, and it has an air resistance. So just like we saw with the pop wind, keep in mind it will never go over a certain speed. It will not constantly accelerate, and that makes it much easier to control it actually. But just keep that in mind, it is a wind force. So just like with the pop axis force, down here we have at least three forces. The follow scale, which as the name suggests follows the curve, which is basically the lift scale in the pop axis force. The suction scale towards the center curve that we put in, and an orbit scale, which means it rotates around. And they're all set to 1. Let's increase the suction scale and maybe the follow scale and see what happens. And this is something where I have to, as usual, balance the whole thing myself. So let's try something like that. And maybe let's make the influence a little bit bigger. And here you can now see what it's doing. It really follows the curve. And this is really cool because it's great for some kind of magic effect and all that. And what you can see as well, it's not very strong, but it also rotates around the curve. And this is something you can increase, of course, with the orbit scale. So let's see how that looks like. It's a bit strong when you just do it in the middle of it. And as you can see, it also tends to make the points shoot outwards. So let's increase the suction scale again. And now it's kind of balanced out. And you can see how the points are rotating around the curve. And let's actually increase the suction scale a little bit. Yeah, something like that. Now the fourth velocity scale here is the inherent velocity scale. So in case you have a curve that is moving and has a velocity on it, then this can be taken into account. But this is something I usually don't do, so we can ignore that. The other forces you can actually control even more, because as you can see here, there is for each of them a force fall off. And that means this is relative to the distance to the curve. So the further away it gets, the less strong the effect goes. And this is something you can use on top to control the effect even more. I will not do this here because the defaults are pretty reasonable and we don't want to go too deep into the details. But let's look what else is there. There's also under global forces a general multiplier for all the forces. So here you can define again how strong the force should be relative to the distance to the curve. If you want this to change for everything on top. And then there is a force along the length. So if you want the whole forces to become less strong along the curve, you can control this here. So plenty of ways of controlling the influence. And then there's shaping. And actually shaping, I totally missed that. If you go into the guides, you can turn on show curve only, and then you only see the curve that we put in. And what you can actually see is that it resamples that curve anyway. So the resampling that I do out of a habit after a draw curve wasn't actually necessary. You can actually do this internally anyway. And then there's also a scale radius along the length. So if we show the area again, or the max influence area, we can even change this based on where we are along the curve. So maybe something like this. even though this wouldn't make sense, but I wanted to show you that you can change the influence area along the curve. You shouldn't do this in the beginning actually, but maybe something like this can make sense. So you have a lot of control in this regards as well. So let's bring this back as well. So the thing is though, most of those settings you don't use. In my experience, you mostly work with the different scales. And then to make this actually interesting, we actually should, let's actually fix this. I changed something. I think it was here, this. So if this is more or less stable, let's do something like this. But what I actually wanted to show you is it tends to be a bit of a mathematical approach to forces. So, you know, it's a very strict look. And as usual, what you should always combine this with is a pop force or maybe a pop wind to use the noise function. And by increasing the chaos here a little bit, the whole thing will look really cool. So maybe something like this. And maybe we can lower the orbit speed a little bit. I think we went a bit too far. Then it could look something like this. And again, this is of course perfect for stuff like magic or, you know, even water or something like that. You can let move along a curve. And if we create a bit more points, this will look even nicer. So as you can see, a pretty cool force that very quickly lets you create some really impressive shapes because you can completely control the direction with a curve. So as you can see, a pretty powerful force. Just play around with this a little bit so that you get a feel for it and then come up with some cool ideas what you can do with this. For now, I hope this is helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.